welcome to Reformed Thinking. It is really great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone.
So imagine you are stepping up to a public microphone. You are looking out at this, completely hostile crowd, and you know that the very next sentence out of your mouth will either ignite a bloody civilian riot or it will get you executed by the state for treason.
Right, there is no third option there.
Yeah, no third option at all. You are completely trapped. And that is the precise scenario we're looking at today. We are examining two comprehensive theological expositions on Matthew 22.1522.
Which you probably know as the famous render unto Caesar passage.
Right. Our mission for today's deep dive is to uncover the strict distinction between our civic duty and our absolute devotion to God. And we are viewing this entirely through a Reformed theological lens that adheres to the Westminster Confession.
Yeah, that is a really crucial framework for us today.
Definitely. Now, as always, just a quick ground rule for our discussion. We will let each other finish our thoughts completely without interrupting throughout the audio.
I agree. That is always a good rule to maintain.
Okay, let's unpack this. To grasp why this question about taxes is so explosive, we first, we really need to set the historical scene.
We do. Context is everything here.
Right. So we are situated on the Tuesday of Passion Week. Jesus is teaching in the temple courts. And this is just days before he goes to the cross.
Yes, the tension in Jerusalem is already at a boiling point.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the crowd approaching him is this unnatural, unholy alliance. You have the Pharisees, who were the rigorous religious purists of the day, standing side by side with Herodians.
Right, the political compromisers.
Yeah, the ones completely loyal to Rome. And, these two groups despised each other.
They absolutely hated each other. To understand the gravity of this alliance, you have to look at their origins.
Yeah, give us some background on that.
Well, the Pharisees trace their theological lineage back to the Maccabean revolt, so their whole identity was built on strict separation from Gentile influence.
They wanted nothing to do with pagan culture.
Nothing at all. They believed that Israel's subjugation to Rome was a direct result of failing to keep the Torah meticulously.
Okay, so that is the religious side. What about the Herodians?
Right. Then you have the Herodians. And they are not a religious sect at all. They are a political faction.
Purely political.
Yeah, their livelihood, their status, their wealth, all of it depends on keeping the Herodian dynasty in place, and that means keeping Rome happy.
Wow. So for these two groups to walk into the temple courts together, it is like seeing water and oil suddenly mix.
Yeah, it is shocking. The only thing that could unite them was a shared lethal hatred for the Son of God.
And the trap they set for him centers around a highly flammable crisis, which is the Roman poll tax.
Yes, the text calls it the consos.
Right. The sources specify this is a specific head tax instituted in AD 6 by the Roman governor Critias.
And we have to be clear here, this is not just an annoying bureaucratic fee.
No, this tax had a huge body count attached to it, right?
A massive body count. When Quirinius instituted that census and the accompanying tax, it sparked a major zealot rebellion led by a man named Judas of Galilee.
Judas of Galilee, right. What was his main argument?
He essentially preached that God alone was the Lord of Israel. So paying a direct head tax to a pagan emperor was tantamount to high treason against the Almighty.
That is a very intense theological position.
It was. And the Roman military response was brutal and swift. Thousands of Jewish rebels were crucified. Entire villages were burned to the ground.
So the memory of that slaughter is still very fresh for the people in the temple.
Oh, very fresh. So when the Pharisees and Herodians walk up to Jesus decades later and ask, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?" They are not asking a theoretical question in a university classroom.
Right. It is not an academic debate.
Not at all. They are dragging a barrel of gunpowder into the temple and, just handing Jesus the match.
Let us map out the lethal nature of this trap for the listener, because it is a brilliant, vicious snare.
It really is.
If Jesus answers, yes, it is lawful, pay the tax, the Pharisees win. They will immediately denounce him to the crowds as a traitor to the covenant.
Right. They will paint him as a false messiah who sympathizes with pagan Rome.
Yeah, and his public influence is destroyed instantly. The crowds would turn on him.
But if he answers, no, do not pay the tax, then the Herodians win.
Because they are standing right there ready to report him.
Exactly. Precisely. They are ready to run to the Roman governor and charge him with sedition, which carries the death penalty.
And the Greek text confirms that vicious intent, does it not?
It does. Matthew writes that the Pharisees took counsel how they might entangle him in his words.
Entangle. What is the original word there?
The verb used there is pagidosin.
Okay.
And if you look at extra-biblical literature from that period or how that word is utilized in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it carries a highly specific connotation.
What kind of
It
connotation?
describes a hunter setting a hidden snare to catch a bird.
Oh, wow. So it is predatory.
Highly predatory. The questioners were not seeking truth. They were not wrestling with a genuine ethical dilemma. They were hunting.
That brings up a fascinating point regarding the psychology of hypocrisy.
How so?
Well, the way they approach him is just sickeningly sweet. I mean, they walk up and say, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth."
Yeah, the flattery is heavy.
It is so heavy. They use the vocabulary of orthodox righteousness to mask a murderous intent.
It is chilling, really.
It really is. It is a terrifying reality that polished external religion can completely camouflage a hardened, rebellious heart.
I would say it is the apex of moral evil. Hypocrisy is not just, failing to live up to your ideals. It is weaponizing the language of holiness to execute wickedness.
Right. They are standing in the sacred precincts of the temple, speaking the language of divine truth, while actively plotting to murder the author of that truth.
That is a great way to summarize it.
It's kind of like a modern hostile press briefing, right? Where reporters ask these loaded gotcha questions to force a public relations disaster.
Yeah, that is a solid analogy.
Except here, the stakes are not a bad news cycle. The stakes are lethal.
Absolutely lethal. But Christ does not just listen to the syllables coming out of their mouths.
No, he reads the motives buried in their chests. Verse 18 states plainly that Jesus perceived their wickedness.
He instantly reverses the interrogation.
He really does. He does not take the bait. Instead, he asks for a visual aid. He says, "Show me the coin for the tax."
And what happens next is so revealing.
Right, because out of their own robes, right there in the temple, they produce a Roman denarius and hand it to him.
What's fascinating here is the massive systematic theological weight carried by that short phrase. Jesus perceived their wickedness.
Yes, let us get into the theology of that moment.
Our sources highlight how Christ's immediate, infallible knowledge of their malice affirms the doctrine of God's exhaustive foreknowledge.
So he is not just guessing what they are up to.
No, he knows their hearts perfectly. Within our Reformed framework, this completely dismantles modern theological errors like open theism.
Let us pause and clarify that for the listener, because that is a big claim.
Sure, yeah.
Open theism essentially argues that God does not know the future choices of free creatures, or that his knowledge is somehow limited by human action. It acts as if God is reacting to events as they unfold.
Right, that is an accurate summary of that view. And that view collapses entirely upon reading this text.
Because Christ is not reacting at all.
Not even a little bit. He is not caught off guard by their flattery. Furthermore, this affirms his absolute sovereignty as mediator, which aligns perfectly with the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Oh yes, chapter 5 on providence.
Yes, chapter 5 and also chapter 8 on Christ the mediator. The confession makes it clear that the sovereign Lord actively navigates the treacherous snares of reprobate men to fulfill the divine decree.
His omniscience is actively operating here.
And his strategy in asking for the coin is just brilliant.
Because by producing the denarius, the Pharisees implicate themselves. I mean, think about the physical reality of this moment. They are trying to trap Jesus between devotion to God and civic responsibility, but they themselves are carrying the token of that civil obligation.
They have it right there in their pockets.
Yes, they are actively participating in the Roman economic system. They utilize the Roman roads, they trade in the Roman markets, and they benefit from the administrative order of the empire.
Yeah, they are fully embedded in it.
So by reaching into their robes and pulling out that coin, they expose their supposed moral dilemma as opportunistic rage.
They self-incriminate. But the brilliance of Christ's response goes even further when you look at the syntax of the exchange.
The Greek syntax.
Yes. In verse 17, the opponents frame their question using the Greek verb didmi, which translates as to give.
Okay, so they ask, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar?
Right. They phrase it as if the tax is a voluntary gift, like a free will offering of devotion.
Oh, I see.
But in verse 21, Jesus corrects their grammar. He replies using the verb apodudmi, which means to render or to pay back a debt.
Oh, wow. That is a massive shift in category.
That is huge.
Going from a voluntary gift to a mandatory debt completely alters the theological landscape.
It fundamentally changes the ground of the debate. Giving to Caesar is not an act of worship. It is not a voluntary gift of your devotion.
No, it is a transaction.
Right. It is simply paying back a temporal debt for the services provided by the civil state. The coin was minted by Caesar's government. It belongs to his economic system.
So therefore, paying the tax is simply returning what already belongs to that temporal administration.
Yeah, that is the logic Jesus employs.
So if Jesus establishes that paying the tax is just settling a temporal debt, he introduces a natural friction point for the early church.
A very significant friction point.
Because where does that debt end? Acknowledging that the coin is owed to the state forces us to define the legitimate boundaries of the state.
And Jesus does exactly, he does that very thing. He looks at the silver denarius and asks whose image and inscription are on it.
They reply, Caesar's.
And then Christ delivers the first half of his famous mandate. Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
We have to consider what was physically stamped on that piece of silver, though.
Yes, let us look at that.
Because the coin bore the ischion, the physical image, of Tiberius Caesar.
And the inscription, too.
Right. The inscription on those specific denarii typically read, Tiberius Caesar Divi Augusti Filius Augustus.
Which translates to Tiberius Caesar, worshipful son of the divine Augustus.
That is a blatant claim of divine status.
It is pure idolatry.
Wait, I have to push back here, or at least ask the question our listeners are probably thinking.
Sure, go ahead.
The confession states that God ordains the magistrate. But Tiberius Caesar literally claimed to be a god on the very currency they were using.
Yeah, it was stamped right on the silver.
So how can Reformed Christians square submitting to an entity that fundamentally blasphemes the Creator? How does paying a tax with a blasphemous coin not constitute idolatry?
That is a highly practical question, and it is the precise tension our sources address today.
Okay, break it down for us.
The distinction lies in the sphere of authority. The text establishes that the state possesses a real providential, yet strictly subordinate authority.
Subordinate being the key word.
Yes. Our sources make it clear that this command completely aligns with the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 23.
Which is titled, Of the Civil Magistrate.
Right. That chapter establishes that God has ordained civil magistrates to be under him and over the people for his own glory and the public good.
So the authority of the state is derivative. It is not inherent to Caesar at all. It is delegated by God.
Precisely. Consequently, Christians have a legitimate civic obligation. Paying taxes, honoring magistrates, and obeying the laws of the land do not constitute spiritual apostasy.
Even when the magistrate is a pagan like Tiberius.
Even then, participation in civil structures is part of the ordinary creaturely life under God's providence.
Because you are paying a debt for the maintenance of civil order. You are not endorsing the emperor's blasphemous theological claims.
Right. You are using his currency to maintain the roads and the courts, not bowing to his statue.
The sources specify that this teaching refutes two massive historical errors regarding the relationship between the church and the state.
Yes, there are errors on both sides of the spectrum.
Let us break those down. What is the first one?
On one side, it refutes the historical Roman Catholic error of collapsing the church and the state.
How did that look historically?
Well, historically, the papacy attempted to wield both the spiritual sword and the temporal sword. They claimed ultimate authority over earthly kings and civil governments.
Right.
But Christ's words demonstrate that the civil magistrate has a distinct, legitimate sphere of operation outside the direct administration of the church.
Okay, so that is the first error. What is the second?
On the other side, it refutes the modern secularist error of making the state ultimate.
I see that a lot today.
We all do. The secular mindset acts as if the government owns every sphere of human existence: the family, education, the economy, and religion.
They want jurisdiction over all of it.
Yeah. But Jesus acknowledges that Caesar has a realm, and by defining what belongs to Caesar, he immediately places a boundary around civil authority.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. Caesar gets the tax coin. He does not get the soul.
He does not.
That answers the practical friction point for a believer navigating a hostile system today.
I agree.
Believers are called to fulfill their earthly duties with excellence, honesty, and respect, regardless of the pagan nature of the system.
Yeah, you pay your taxes and obey lawful civil ordinances.
And you do it not out of a secular pragmatism or out of a cowardly fear of human reprisal, but as a deliberate act of obedience toward the God who ordains all civil authority.
Romans 13 reinforces this entirely. The magistrate is a minister of God for good.
But the caveat is the boundary line. You render to Caesar only the things that are Caesar's.
Right. The state governs externally and temporally.
So the moment a government demands worship or demands that a believer violate their conscience, which is bound by the word of God, that government has trespassed its delegated bounds.
That is spot on. Think of Daniel's 3 friends in Babylon.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yes, they served the Babylonian state faithfully. They contributed to the society.
They were high-ranking officials, actually.
We were, but the moment King Nebuchadnezzar demanded they bow to the golden statue, they refused.
They drew the line at worship.
Caesar gets the silver, God gets the knee.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Hmm.
That boundary line is what makes the second half of Christ's statement so staggering.
It really is the focal point of the whole debate.
While Caesar claims the minted silver, Jesus introduces an infinitely higher claim. He finishes the mandate by saying, "And to God the things that are God's."
Right.
If the coin goes back to Caesar because it bears Caesar's image, the inevitable question follows: what goes back to God?
This invokes the very dawn of creation in Genesis 1:26-27.
Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.
Yes. Because man bears the imago Dei, the image of God, the Creator claims the totality of the human person.
The totality.
The coin bears the image of the emperor, so it belongs to the imperial treasury. You bear the image of the Creator, so you belong entirely to him.
That is such a heavy realization.
It is. He claims the mind, the heart, the affections, and the will. Every faculty, every breath, and every power of thought belongs entirely to the one whose image is stamped upon your nature.
The two clauses in Christ's statement are not symmetrical in weight at all, then.
No, they are vastly different.
We often read them as if Jesus is splitting life down the middle, like 50% to the government, 50% to religion.
Yeah, people do that all the time. But that is a complete misreading of the text.
It is a devastating misreading. Caesar's claim is derivative, partial, and temporary. God's claim is original, total, and supreme.
And this reality exposes all forms of idolatry.
Because autonomy is an absolute illusion.
It is. We are not our own. The fallen human heart constantly seeks to negotiate with God, trying to divide life into neat little compartments.
Right, we say, I will give a little to religion on Sunday, a little to public respectability during the week, and I will keep the rest of my inner life for my own personal preferences.
But the doctrine of the imago Dei destroys that illusion.
Completely.
To withhold your heart from God is not a minor defect in your spiritual performance. It is outright theft of divine property.
Now, I must impartially report the specific applications our source texts make regarding modern issues at this point.
Okay, what do the authors say?
Well, the authors of the provided texts argue that this specific passage and the theology of the imago Dei actively refutes the social gospel, liberal theology, and critical race theory.
That is a very specific modern application.
It is. The authors claim that these modern movements seek to divide human identity along fleshly, secular lines or intersectional power dynamics.
Okay.
The authors maintain that true human identity cannot be found in temporal categories of class or race, but is found solely in the restored image of God through the regenerating work of the Holy Spirit.
So they see it as a categorical error.
Yes. They argue that elevating secular political or social categories above the imago Dei is a form of political idolatry.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of Reformed theology, that assertion aligns with the understanding that our primary foundational reality is our standing before a holy God as his image bearers.
Right.
When any ideological system attempts to redefine humanity primarily by temporal grievances, material wealth, or social hierarchies, it obscures the absolute claim God has on the soul.
Let us follow the logical progression of that absolute claim.
Okay, let's do that.
If we take it to heart that God demands the total surrender of the human person because his image is stamped on our very nature, we are faced with a devastating reality about our own performance.
We really are.
If the standard is total, flawless devotion of the mind, heart, affections, and will, we have to look in the mirror and ask, who among us has actually met that standard?
No one, not a single person.
And this brings us to a crucial theological mechanism that the sources outline.
Which is the distinct law-gospel dynamic present in this passage.
Right. When Jesus commands us to render to God the things that are God's, he is utilizing the first use of the moral law.
He is.
Explain that mechanism for us. What is the first use of the law?
The first use of the law acts as a mirror. It reveals the absolute holiness of God and simultaneously the utter depravity of human nature.
So it shows us what we actually look like spiritually.
Yes. When the law demands perfect obedience, it exposes our inability to provide it. It shuts every mouth and holds the entire world accountable before God's judgment seat.
So when Jesus issues this command, it reveals the horrifying truth that we've all given God divided hearts and distracted worship.
We all fall short of that total devotion.
I think comparing this concept to spiritual tax evasion is a highly accurate way to visualize the mechanism.
Spiritual tax evasion, I like that.
Imagine an auditor looking at the accounting ledger of your life.
Okay, tracking the analogy.
We often take our best assets, our time, our deepest loves, our fierce loyalties, our mental energy, and we hide them in offshore accounts of self-interest.
Right, we keep them for ourselves.
We actively try to keep them off the books so the Creator cannot claim them. We willingly give the visible, heavily taxed currency to the state to avoid prison.
Sure, we want to stay out of trouble.
And we pay our social dues to maintain respectability in our communities. But the core capital of our soul, the affections of our heart, we keep hidden for ourselves.
That is a terrifyingly accurate analogy. We render to Caesar because we fear temporal punishment, but we rob God because we presume upon his patience.
Wow, yes. We presume upon his patience.
The diagnostic weight of Christ's command exposes every single one of us as spiritual thieves.
But the theology does not leave us in despair.
Thankfully, no.
The glory of the gospel breaks through the darkness of our total inability. The source's point is directly to the gospel fulfillment.
Because someone has to settle the account.
Right. If we have marred the image, and if we have failed to render the devotion we owe, how is the debt settled?
It is settled by the true and perfect image of God.
Which is Jesus.
Yes. The Apostle Paul in Colossians 1:15 states that Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God.
And Hebrews says something similar.
Right. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 1, verse 3, declares that Christ is the exact imprint of his nature.
So beautiful.
Where Adam failed, and where we continually mar the image through our sin, Christ perfectly maintained it.
And this is where we see the magnificent mechanism of his active and passive obedience on display.
This is a critical distinction in Reformed theology.
Let us break down both the active and the passive obedience for the listener. Let us start with the active. What is Christ doing during his earthly ministry to settle our debt?
Active obedience refers to Christ's positive, minute-by-minute fulfillment of every precept of the moral law.
So it is more than just not sinning.
Much more. It is not just that he avoided sinning. He actively loved the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength, every single second of his earthly life.
He rendered total devotion.
Yes. Where we failed to render our devotion, Christ stood in our place as our covenant head and rendered flawless, uninterrupted obedience to the Father in thought, word, and deed.
And what happens to that act of obedience?
This act of righteousness is what gets imputed or credited to the believer's account by faith.
That is incredible. And then there is his passive obedience.
Right.
Because mere days after this intense debate in the temple, Jesus was arrested, beaten, and nailed to a Roman cross.
Passive obedience refers to Christ willingly submitting to the penalty of the broken law.
He took the punishment.
He absorbed the wrath of God against our sin. On the cross, he paid the infinite tax demanded by divine justice.
He settled the ledger.
He shed his own blood to satisfy the massive debt of spiritual tax evasion that we could never afford to pay in a billion lifetimes. He rendered to God the ultimate sacrifice.
Because Christ accomplishes this massive substitutionary work, the daily life of the believer is fundamentally altered.
It changes everything about how we live.
The passage then provides what Reformed theologians call the third use of the law.
Or the tertius osis legis.
Right, as codified in the Westminster Confession, chapter 19. Let us unpack how that operates in the life of a Christian today.
Well, for the justified believer, someone who is united to Christ by faith, the moral law is no longer a sentence of condemnation.
The debt is paid.
The debt is fully paid. Therefore, the law now functions as a guide, a rule of life, to show us what pleases our Heavenly Father.
So it is no longer a threat.
No, it is a path to walk in. And civic duties, like paying taxes and honoring the state, are completely transformed.
They are no longer a burden of secular pragmatism.
Precisely.
Well,
When a believer pays their taxes or obeys the speed limit or honors a civil contract, they are not just trying to avoid a fine.
what are they doing then?
Those mundane actions become acts of grateful worship.
Grateful worship.
Yes. The believer learns, by the ongoing grace of the Holy Spirit, to yield their heart and life to the Lord as a pattern of sanctification. You submit to the temporal magistrate because you adore the eternal King who instituted the magistrate.
Christ's breathtaking answer to the Pharisees leaves the crowd entirely stunned.
I mean, how could it not?
He synthesized civil responsibility, total depravity, the doctrine of creation, and the coming judgment into a single sentence.
It is unmatched wisdom.
But the reaction of the original audience, as recorded in the text, carries a terrifying warning for anyone studying this passage today.
We have to look closely at verse 22.
What does it say?
It records the immediate aftermath. When they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way.
They marveled and left him. The enemies are publicly silenced.
Yep.
Their brilliant trap has collapsed entirely, and they are intellectually defeated by the unsearchable wisdom of the Son of God.
But the text makes it painfully clear that they are not spiritually surrendered.
Not at all.
That is the tragedy of this conclusion. They possessed an intellectual admiration for his rhetoric.
They respected the debate skills.
They recognized his brilliance and his ability to navigate a lethal theological snare without a scratch, but they completely lacked saving adoration for his person.
They marveled at his intellect, but they left completely unrepentant.
They withdrew into the crowd with their hypocrisy fully intact.
This raises a massive concern about the state of our own hearts when we interact with theology.
I think about this all the time.
It is entirely possible to possess orthodox vocabulary, to marvel at the intricacies of Greek syntax, and to appreciate the rigorous logic of the Westminster Confession, while your heart remains a rebel province.
This raises an important question for you, the listener, regarding how we consume theological knowledge today.
Yes, it is a vital question.
Do you read the text just to win debates? Do you listen to expositions simply to marvel at the brilliance of the historical context? Or do you actually bow the knee to the sovereign who spoke the universe into existence?
Because admiration without adoration is just another form of rebellion.
It is a very polite form of rebellion, but it is rebellion nonetheless.
So what does this all mean?
That is the big takeaway.
It means that we cannot remain neutral spectators in the temple courts. We have traced the historical hostility of the Pharisees and Herodians, dissecting the lethal snare they set regarding the kunsos tax. We have seen Christ's divine omniscience effortlessly unmask their hypocrisy, affirming his total sovereignty.
He sees right through it.
We have observed the clear boundaries he established for civil government, granting Caesar his temporal due while actively denying the state ultimate authority over the soul.
A vital boundary for us today.
And we have confronted the absolute terrifying standard of the imago Dei, the reality that God claims the entirety of our human nature, a standard met only by the perfect active and passive obedience of Jesus Christ.
The gospel is our only hope there.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder off-air.
Something to take with you.
Look at the coins of your daily attention, your anxieties and your ambitions. Look at where you spend the currency of your mental energy and your deepest affections. Whose image is stamped on them?
Are you rendering them to God?
Are you spending the wealth of your mind on temporal kingdoms that will eventually rust, fade, and collapse? If you are an image bearer of the eternal King, what piece of your soul are you still trying to hand over to a temporary Caesar?
That is a piercing thought to end on.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Word. Keep resting in the grace of the perfect image, and we will catch you next time on Reformed Thinking. Farewell.